China and India, Asia's most populous countries and two of its largest economies. Although India's Remove China apps has been suspended on the Google Play Store, the incident has reflected a deep-rooted anti-China sentiment among the Indian public. Where does this come from, and what does it mean? How can the impacts be addressed and minimized? And with the two sides agreeing to peacefully resolve the Ladakh standoff, what can we expect from the negotiations? To talk about these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Chen Hong of East China Normal University, independent current affairs commentator Anar Tangen, and Atul Aneja, strategic affairs editor of The Hindu. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me begin with you, Atul. The app in India, which is called Remove China Apps, although it has been suspended from Google Play Store, but obviously it had targeted Chinese apps for boycott, and it went viral on social media. But where does it come from?
Well, to be honest, there has been a very strong anti-China sentiment, which was residual earlier, but I think after the COVID-19, it has accelerated much more. And you see the response to the app, this particular app, as a reflection of that anti-China sentiment, which was latent, but which has grown. But I don't think that's the entire story. There is another track of a neutral response, if not a friendly response to China. And I think there's a generational issues here as well. But it comes from that and got aggravated. I think a lot has also to do with the media projection of COVID-19. And a lot of the media, in a way, the Indians fed off a lot from what the American media was saying, the mainstream media, and actually went on to believe without any particular proof that the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, originated from Wuhan and probably was done deliberately by China. Somehow that particular sentiment was aired by a couple of news organizations here who went to the extent of calling it the Wuhan virus and the China virus.
But they haven't heard from the other side of the argument. They only believe
not at all
those narratives that this come from Wuhan and the outrageous theory that this is deliberately done by China.
I completely agree with you, but I was just trying to explain as to why it has come from. I don't see any scientific reason for such a kind of a malicious campaign to be carried out. But I suppose we are living in a globalized world, and a lot of what happens in other parts of the world gets communicated through the media and through the social media. And so, people ride on that. And I think these are some of the factors which went behind it. But I'm happy to inform you that today, the government of India has opened its account on TikTok. And I think that's a very good signal which has come. And I'm talking about an hour and a half ago. I just went through this news item on one of the websites. So that's a positive signal coming from the government that, look, we trust something like TikTok, which is hugely popular in India. And I thought that was especially useful in connecting our millennials from both the countries in the Generation Z. And I remember when I was in China, I, as a journalist, I had a translator with me, and she wanted to know certain food items, how they were made. And I asked her, how did you come to know? She said, I saw it on TikTok. So this was a great connector of our respective soft powers. And I think it is particularly unfortunate that this incident took place. But I don't see that this is a done deal in a way. And there's plenty of room to come back, because frankly, I do see this kind of an anti-China sentiment quite motivated. But I don't see it frankly at a people-to-people level. It is there, but I see it as skin deep compared to what happens, let's say, I don't, when we talk about Pakistan, it's something different. Yeah, but with China, no, it is there. But then, frankly, the exposure to China, our trading community, our students, our people-to-people Bollywood, which has gone into China, and vice versa. I don't really see this sentiment so ingrained or so hardened as of now, and I think it's reversible, and that's where the hope lies.
Yeah.
But we'll have to work at it to reverse it.
Mr. Chen, of course, the Chinese expected the Americans to think the way that this is a China virus, but Indians, did Chinese see this coming?
Yeah, I think actually in China, it's largely expected that the West, anti-China forces, in particular in those countries led by the United States, has been instigating other countries to ally with the United States to join in its anti-China campaign. So I think actually India is being targeted by the United States as a kind of like ally by the United States to support and assist its global campaign against China. On the other hand, obviously, the quadrilateral dialogue between America, Japan, Australia, and India, and in the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, that actually has been envisaged by the United States as a way to contain and also to suppress and deter China's development. So I think actually these are all a kind of like global plan envisaged by the White House as a way to contain China. So no matter it's slandering China in various ways, such as calling the so-called Wuhan virus, or even in India, as the previous commenters were discussing about the app issue. These are all I think actually largely it was quite immature and juvenile gestures to suppress and eradicate the presence of China, because obviously in today's world it is simply impossible.
And NR, Atul just explained that there's a very unique media landscape in India, but I'm a little bit baffled by that. There is no competing views on China issue in India. Why the Indian media focusing on those narratives that are not constructive towards the relations between the two sides?
Well, I don't know that that's true. I know Prem Shah, he's actually written, he was a former Times of India, Atul knows him. Prem has written extensively about this, and he traces a lot of what we're talking about back to 1962, to the skirmish that took place there. In India, it's sold that it was a brilliant battle. India held its own. China was the aggressor. But a recently released report, the Henderson report, which was done at the time and was done by a British, obviously third party, not trying to buy into either side, was trying to assess the military failure on the side of the Indian side. And they basically laid it all out that it was kind of a miscalculation, both militarily and strategically, by the then Prime Minister Nehru, that he was going to kind of get this more land and push China back, and that China would not fight a war. But because of that popular narrative, within the Indian mind, there's this idea that China has been an ongoing aggressor.
But that's 50 years ago. You're saying the Indians are still living that legacy and carrying it on their shoulder.
Yes, I appear on Indian TV quite regularly, 2-3 times a week. I can tell you that this is mentioned almost every single time. The 62 was, for many, it was seen as kind of a humiliation, but it's been sold to the people that it was China who was the aggressor. So then when you have subsequent actions being taken or border disputes, it's always painted that China is the aggressor. So, there's this just popular idea that China is a bad actor, that they're repressive, that they do all sorts of bad things. So that's why it was very easy for them to believe that somehow China was striking out at India as a regional rival. With this COVID-19, it made sense to the people because they've been told all along China's a bad character.
But practically, Atul, India is still buying Chinese products. Chinese products taking actually a considerable market share of the Indian market. For example, 4 of the top 5 smartphones in India market are from China, Xiaomi leading with a 30% share in terms of shipments in the first quarter of 2020. And just 2 years ago, I was in India, and every phone shops almost put a large placard selling Chinese brands. How can the Indians reconcile between buying a large numbers of Chinese products and boycotting Chinese products?
These are the kind of contradictions which shows that there is no unified or a single narrative which is going on in India. And you gave the example of the cell phones, and they are the ones which are relatively cheap and of good quality, and Indians are buying it. So I don't see this boycott China product really going too far. Not only there, but look at the Indian pharmaceutical industry. It's supposed to be, and it is a huge success story the world over, but the raw material for that comes from China. So, you can't have the Indian pharmaceutical industry without China. I was talking to a few industrialists because of this slogan which is given that we should now be self-reliant and be less dependent, or at least diversify our procurement away from China and maybe from other countries. But this guy was telling me, see, look, I have only Chinese company addresses. So I don't know where else to shop for. So I really don't see this boycott call going too far. And as far as investments go, and India needs this, and Prime Minister Modi's Make in India campaign cannot do without foreign investments, because we are producing about, there are 11 million people entering the job market, and we are providing employment to 4 million, 4 to 5. So who fills in the 6 million gap? People can't go back to agriculture. It has to be industry, and IT and biotech can't supply that. So it has to be manufacturing.
Does the Indian government, both at the federal level and the local level, understand the threats there? Because the narratives whipped up by social media influencers like that might harm the economic relationship between the two major economies.
I'll tell you where the concerns are coming. Let me go back to this apps business. You see, there is a debate here that what happens to Indian data, which is collected by, let's say, TikTok and others. There is an argument here saying that that data, which is going into China, shows consumer behavior completely about India, which can be misused against India. So I think if that is a concern, we need a much broader dialogue between India and China. We need cyber issues to be talked about and concerned. If there's a concern, Indians have a concern about 5G, then let that be talked out and expressed and ironed out. I see our dialogue is still quite narrowly focused. We have to broaden it out and talk out our concerns, because there is genuine mistrust. But how do you counter that mistrust? You can only do that by dialogue and coming up at verifiable inferences which build that trust. So I think we have to deepen our dialogue much more. And I do believe that that will be the time when we trust each other, and the relationship will have a self-generating quality of improvement. I think that's where we need to handle, not just at the geopolitical level, which is important, like your earlier guest spoke about. The Quad, for example. Well, China has a concern. Is the Quad going to be used for containment of China? I think that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But it's for India and China to talk about. And when it comes, let's say, to what's happened at the borders, are Chinese and Pakistanis going to get together and grab Kashmir? I mean, these are concerns. So this is something which needs to be talked about. And dialogue has to be framed from the big picture
We'll
level
talk about the border issue
micros.
later on. We have gathered some opinions on the internet on the trust issue. How much trust do peoples on both sides have for the other? Let's take a look at what some of them have been saying. Rundown of several of the social media takes. This RM Matwa said, at regular intervals we find hysteria about discarding Chinese products, and again of great cooperation between India and China. We behave in conflicting ways. Can we not have balanced approach? Once during lockdown, we were waiting for raw material to come from China to prepare medicines. Atul just mentioned that. Professor Chen, some people say the reason that Indians and the Chinese are not so closely interdependent as others is because our economy should step up the cooperation. We are just too little to rely on when there is conflicts propping up.
Yes, I think actually China and India are actually the two largest developing countries in the world. China is the second largest economy, while India is the fifth largest economy. So there is a lot of potential for the two countries to cooperate and collaborate in technological development, R&D, and various issues. We talked about smartphone, we talk about smart TV and other medical science, other areas. So indeed, actually, as a two technologically quite competitive and also quite innovative countries, I think there are a lot of things actually the two countries can work together. On the other hand, actually, I think actually there should be the necessity to foment and foster the kind of mutual trust between the two countries and two peoples. People actually, previous two commentators were actually discussing about a kind of historical differences. But differences are actually historical, but actually we should not let it to be developing into disputes or even confrontations. But actually, indeed, into this world when supply chain is actually the key to international global collaboration, I think India, China, various countries should actually be collaborating in today's world.
Okay, let's talk about another source of distrust, which is the border issue. Of course, the recently border disputes at Ladakh, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said China and India are willing and able to properly solve border issue through negotiation and consultation, and added the overall situation in the border is generally stable and under control. Why there are border disputes and even some low-level skirmishes happening all the time between China and India?
Well, several reasons for that. Partly it's historical, for historical reasons, because our borders were not entirely defined, and there are competing interpretations in various sectors out of the 3,000 odd kilometers. Only few areas are the ones which have been settled, that which we can call the international borders. But there are a lot of areas where we have divergent interpretations, and this is the historical legacy.
But do we have a tacit agreement that where the line of control is, and we should probably keep our incursion to the minimum?
Well, we have a protocol. Your first question, do we have a common line of the border? No. The Chinese have their own interpretation of the line of actual control, LAC, and India has its own interpretation, and there are divergences between the two. And the border dialogue, which has begun for many, many years now, since the 90s, has still not come to that convergence. Along with that, we have the second element, which are called the confidence building measures, which really start from 1993. Which actually laid down very detailed protocols that in case we come to eyeball to eyeball face-off, that how should each side behave? How should you react? What is the role of the local commanders? How does it go up the chain? These are very detailed protocols. And there are lines of communication between India and China right from the local level to the military headquarters. So that's been done quite well over the years. And if you see on the plus side, we haven't fired a shot at each other for as far as I can remember. So that confidence building measure protocol, despite aberrations, has worked. But on the line of actual control, it's very definition, demarcation, delineation. That's a process which has not been done.
Well,
and that's a cause of this.
As you said, the protocols are there, but people are working on both sides. Probably there are too many of them and too much activity. Sometimes people break protocols. What is the really problem is how do we keep it at control? Don't let it get out of hands.
Sure. And as you see in this particular case, we had this exchange of blows by Indian and Chinese troops, which are pretty ugly in early May. But it's been contained right there. And we are having active communication in tune with the protocols which were laid down from before, over the years, starting from 1993. But I think there are also deeper strategic issues which sort of come into play. And I do think that, well, I've written about it, so I can say it openly. It's from August 5, when India removed the special status of Kashmir, I think there were a lot of diplomacy which was required to reassure our neighbors, and that includes both China and Pakistan, as to the Indian intent was only domestic and nothing more. There is no change in India's outlook on the borders.
Yeah.
I think we missed a trick in our communication out there. And I think that starts a process. Though we do have, if you look at it, from August 5, 2019, we finally have the Chennai summit, that is informal summit between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, where we have another chance to get back to normal. But unfortunately, the misperceptions continue. Then the COVID issue happened, and a lot of propaganda has started about linking what happened on the border with developments in South China Sea, with Taiwan, and other things. And I do believe that while we may have our differences, but one thing which I have learned when I was in China is that the sanctity of the one China principle, I think these are the parameters which need to be recognized. Just as India has its own sensitivities. For example, we talk about the border area.
Okay.
But India has a lot of sensitivity about the waters, because waters of the Indus River are flowing from this side. And there is this apprehension that Chinese move further ahead, then there's a possibility of diversion of those waters. And that's another strategic concern. So
all you said
you need a bigger
valid,
conversation here.
But Anar, I understand that both India and China have their own domestic politics, have their own interests, but the overriding theme is that can the two major Asian countries and economies cooperate despite those differences, despite those difficulties? Do they have the wish and the tools to make that happen?
Well, it takes leadership. Modi and Xi have gotten together a number of times, but it really hasn't kind of followed through. There's always been some sort of incident that is in between. There's been no shots fired on the frontier since 1972. So it is possible to control the situation. But this is not just, there's a lot of history in there, but there's also some actions. China reinforces its border. They build a road. The Indians build a road. There's mismessaging, especially as it goes to Kashmir. And these types of things demonstrate that there's between these two civilization states, there's a huge communication gap. They don't understand each other. The people I talk for India, and I think Atul can attest to this, very little knowledge of China and vice versa. So this is a real weakness in the relationship. It's very easy to demonize people you don't really know, who you've only heard things about.
There are also people who are very optimistic about this, because in our app, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, he's a professor of politics at East China Normal University, in an article titled "Transcending the VUCA World, India and China Commemorate 70 Years of Diplomatic Ties." He basically argued that the China-Indian relations defy three major theses that is misguided Western thinking, including Fukuyama's End of History, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, and Graham Allison's Thucydides' Trap. So, Professor Chen, do you think China and India can actually provide a template for a big power relationship, defying the three theses I mentioned, and be really cooperative and collaborative?
Yeah, I think actually the two countries have a lot in common, a lot of mutual interests and common benefits. So that will actually be binding, the two countries under, the banner of globalization and, collaboration and global collaboration. I think actually China and India are actually active members of the non-alliance movement. That actually is the most important common ground that two countries share. Actually, the previous two commentators mentioned that actually since 1972, not a single shot had been fired against each other. So in other words, in spite of actually the skirmishes, the incursions that actually sometimes occur between the two countries, but still, the general situation, the general scenario has been in control, as Hua Chunying has been reiterating. Actually, the border issues have been in control, largely in control, and has been stable. And the two countries have been actually trying to use peaceful negotiation and discussion to solve those issues. Still, those are actually very proactive and constructive attitudes. So in other words, in particular against the current background of the world of uncertainty with the COVID-19 epidemic, still rampaging around the world. So in particular, I think actually global collaboration, in particular with the two giants in Asia, should be collaborating together in this regard.
Atul, Mr. Chen mentioned a very good point. Although we fought a war 60 years ago, but over the past 6 decades, probably we have seen some fist fights, but we haven't seen bullet fights. And that's a good thing. And Anar mentioned it takes leadership to dispel the distrust. But what can we expect our leaders to do?
Well, first and foremost is that we have to continue this informal summits because I'm having covered the Wuhan summit from China and closely observed the Chennai summit. These two leaders bond with each other. There is a personal chemistry with each other, and I have no doubt about it. Now the next thing is to institutionalize this particular chemistry into real dialogue among our bureaucracies and downstream it.
Can they?
I think that's where we are missing the trick. They have the will, but they need to follow it up more rigorously than they have done it so far. They need to pursue it and persuade the bureaucracies that, look, we think differently. And these are two civilizational states, and rise of Asia is possible only if these two giants come together.
But they have domestic politics to worry about, probably more so for Modi.
I do understand that. But I think there we have to look at how our worldview. We are no longer living in the unipolar era of the collapse of Soviet Union. That's 1991. We are entered a multipolar world era. And I think our leaders have to recognize that we have to collaborate not with one pole anymore. The United States will remain one of the poles, but China has emerged. It's already the second largest economy. India is the fifth largest economy, and there is Russia around. And Europe will be another one. So it is a new world order which is emerging, and we got to address it by not putting our eggs in one basket. And that will explain that while we engage the United States, don't go to the extent of going across the Malacca Straits.
Thank you very much, Atul. Thank you, NR. And thank you, Professor Chen. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.